In the heart of Rio de Janeiro, one of the world's most vibrant cities, a unique social phenomenon occurred. The police, a symbol of law and order, vanished abruptly in 2017, creating a vacuum that was promptly filled by the city's notorious gangs. This sudden turn of events isn't a plot from a dystopian novel, but a grim reality that Rio's favelas had to grapple with. It presents a chilling look into what happens when the thin blue line, a metaphor for law enforcement, disappears and society teeters on the edge of chaos. The collapse of law enforcement in Rio de Janeiro wasn't a sudden implosion, but a gradual decay. Corruption, budget cuts, and a loss of faith in the system gnawed away at the integrity and effectiveness of the police force. This gradual degradation reached its zenith on February 17, 2017, when the police went on strike, leaving the city's citizens to fend for themselves. But nature abhors a vacuum. The disappearance of the police was swiftly followed by the ascendancy of the city's gangs. The Red Command and the Pure Third Command, two of the most powerful gangs, capitalized on the power vacuum. They began to establish their own form of order, a clear demonstration of the dynamics of power and control. In the favelas of Rio, where the state's presence was already minimal, the gang's rule was hardly a novelty. But with the police absence, their influence expanded and their rule became more brutal and absolute. They established curfews, carried out punishments, and even managed garbage collection and distribution of basic goods. However, this wasn't a benevolent rule. Violence escalated, and fear became a constant companion for the residents. The gangs, with their unchecked power, ruled with an iron fist. It was a stark reminder that the absence of law enforcement doesn't necessarily lead to anarchy. Instead, it can lead to a different, often brutal, form of order. The case of Rio de Janeiro provides an illuminating study into the consequences of the collapse of law enforcement. It's a complex tapestry of power plays, human resilience, and the instinct for survival. But it also serves as a warning. The erosion of law enforcement and the rise of gang rule are not isolated phenomena. They are part of a larger global pattern, a silent undercurrent that could potentially reshape the world as we know it if left unchecked. The seeds of law enforcement's collapse were sown long before the strike in 2017. The decay started with a cocktail of economic, social, and environmental factors, each adding a layer of strain on the fragile fabric of societal order. The global financial crisis of 2008 hit Brazil particularly hard. The country's economy stuttered and tripped, plunging millions into poverty. The government, grappling with a shrinking budget and a growing list of demands, started to cut corners. Among the first victims of these austerity measures was the police force. Budget cuts meant fewer resources, less training, and lower morale among the officers. On top of the economic strain, there was an environmental crisis. Rio de Janeiro, a city cradled by mountains and lapped by the sea, is no stranger to natural disasters. Flooding and landslides are common occurrences, often leading to loss of life and property. The escalating frequency and intensity of these disasters, driven by climate change, put additional pressure on the city's already stretched resources. Social unrest was another key trigger. The favelas, densely populated neighborhoods often characterized by substandard living conditions, were hotbeds of dissent. The residents, grappling with poverty, crime, and a lack of basic services, were disillusioned by the state's inability to improve their lives. They saw the police, not as protectors, but as oppressors, often resorting to excessive force and corruption. The police strike in 2017 was the final straw, the event that tipped the scales and sent the city spiraling into chaos. But it was the culmination of years of neglect, corruption, and societal strain. The absence of law enforcement was merely the visible symptom of a deeper, more insidious malaise that had been festering for years. The rise of the gangs, therefore, was not a spontaneous event. It was the result of a power vacuum created by the retreat of the state. The Red Command and the Pure Third Command, with their established networks and resources, were quick to seize the opportunity. They stepped into the void left by the police and started to exert their control, filling the vacuum with their own brutal brand of order. What happened in Rio de Janeiro is a stark reminder of how precarious our societal structures are. It shows how quickly order can unravel when the institutions that uphold it start to falter. It's a cautionary tale of how the absence of effective law enforcement can create a vacuum that is quickly filled by those willing to use force and fear to maintain control. The collapse of law enforcement in Rio is not just a Brazilian problem, it's a global warning. It's a symptom of a world under strain, a world teetering on the edge of a precipice. As the state receded, the initial shockwave reverberated through the city. The sudden absence of law enforcement was felt in every corner, from the bustling business districts to the cramped favelas. The scenes of chaos were reminiscent of a disaster movie, one without a hero to step in and restore order. The police, once a constant presence, had vanished overnight. Their stations, once symbols of authority, were now empty husks, abandoned and vulnerable. The state, blindsided by the suddenness of the event, floundered. The government's initial response was to downplay the severity of the situation. They attempted to assure the public that it was a temporary problem, that negotiations were underway, and that order would be restored soon. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, these assurances rang hollow. Law enforcement agencies from neighboring regions were called in to maintain order, but they were ill-prepared for the scale of the crisis. Their unfamiliarity with the city, its neighborhoods, and its unique challenges only served to exacerbate the situation. They were seen as outsiders, an invading force, which did little to engender trust or cooperation from the locals. The citizens of Rio, meanwhile, were left in a state of confusion and fear. The veneer of civilization, once taken for granted, was stripped away, revealing a stark reality. Without the police to maintain order, the city was at the mercy of those willing to exploit the situation for their own gain. Panic set in as reports of violence and crime started to spread. Carjackings, home invasions, and muggings became commonplace. Shops were looted, buildings were set on fire, and the streets became a battlefield. The thin line between civility and anarchy had been crossed, and the descent into chaos was swift and brutal. Amidst the chaos, the gangs, disciplined and organized, began to consolidate power. In the absence of law enforcement, they were the only semblance of order, albeit a twisted and violent one. They patrolled the streets, enforced their own brand of justice, and even provided basic services in some areas. For many, they were the lesser of two evils, a necessary evil in a city that had been abandoned by its protectors. The collapse of law enforcement in Rio de Janeiro was a shock to the system, a wake-up call to the world. It was a stark demonstration of what can happen when the institutions that are supposed to protect us fail. It was a reminder that order is a fragile thing, easily shattered and difficult to restore. And it was a warning that when the state retreats, others are always ready to step in and fill the vacuum. When society crumbles, the immediate aftermath becomes a desperate fight for survival. The first 72 hours are crucial. They are a period of rapid change, of escalating danger, and of making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The primary concern, above all else, is water. An adult can survive for weeks without food, but only a few days without water. With public utilities likely shut down, survivors must seek alternative sources. Rivers, lakes, rainwater, even dew collected from leaves can sustain life. But these sources can also harbor harmful bacteria, so water must be purified, either by boiling, using purification tablets, or employing a portable water filter if one is available. Next, there is the need for shelter. The elements can be a ruthless adversary. Heat stroke, hypothermia, and exposure are real threats, especially when the comforts of a climate-controlled environment are no longer available. Improvised shelters can be made from materials found in the urban landscape, abandoned vehicles, deserted buildings. Even a simple tarpaulin stretched between 2 points can provide a modicum of protection. Safety, though, is a far more complex issue. With the police gone and gangs ruling the streets, personal security becomes paramount. This might mean retreating to a safer location, fortifying an existing shelter, or seeking out a community of other survivors to share resources and defense. Firearms, if available, can provide a certain level of protection, but they also attract attention and can escalate conflict. Lastly, stability. In a world turned upside down, maintaining a semblance of normality can be a lifeline. This could mean sticking to a routine, such as gathering food and water at certain times, or maintaining social structures like family units or community groups. These familiar patterns can provide a sense of control, a counterweight to the chaos unfolding outside. To survive in a city ruled by gangs, one must adapt, prepare, and stay vigilant. But more than that, one must also be prepared to make difficult choices, to do things they would never have considered in their previous life. The collapse of law enforcement is not just a test of physical endurance, but also a test of moral and psychological resilience. As the old order crumbles, survivors must navigate a new reality, one that is harsh, unforgiving, and fraught with danger. As resources became increasingly scarce, survivors learned to become adept at rationing. Food was no longer a matter of satiating hunger, but ensuring survival. This meant making every scrap, every morsel count. A single can of beans, a bag of rice, or even a rat caught in a makeshift trap could mean the difference between life and death. In the absence of refrigeration, food preservation turned into a crucial skill. Traditional methods such as smoking, drying, and fermenting were rediscovered. Salt, in particular, became more valuable than ever, not just for its flavor, but for its ability to preserve food and make it safe to eat. Food wasn't the only necessity that had to be stretched thin. Fuel, ammunition, medicine, every resource had to be carefully managed. Supplies that once seemed endless were suddenly finite, precious. Waste was not an option. Everything had a purpose, a function. Even items that would have once been discarded were repurposed. Aluminum cans turned into makeshift stoves, plastic bottles into water purifiers. The collapse of currency forced survivors to revert to a barter system. Goods and services were exchanged based on need and availability. A liter of purified water might be worth a handful of bullets, a pile of firewood, or a few hours of labor. In this new world, the value of an item was not determined by market forces, but by its immediate utility and scarcity. Communication, too, had to be rethought. Without the internet, mobile service, or even radio broadcasts, survivors were cut off from the rest of the world. Information became a precious commodity, passed from person to person, often distorted and embellished in the process. But it was also a lifeline, a way to learn about safe routes, food sources, or potential threats. Adapting to life without electricity was perhaps one of the most challenging aspects. Nightfall brought complete darkness, and the lack of heating or air conditioning made temperature regulation a constant struggle. Simple tasks we take for granted, like cooking or reading, became significant challenges. The longer the blackout lasted, the more people had to rely on primitive forms of lighting and heating: candles, oil lamps, wood-burning stoves. This was adaptation in its rawest form, a return to basics, to the skills and knowledge of our ancestors. Survival was no longer a given, but something that had to be fought for, earned. As the old world crumbled, a new one was built from its ruins, forged in the crucible of necessity and resilience. In the face of overwhelming adversity, humans proved themselves capable of incredible resourcefulness and adaptability. Yet within this struggle for survival, the collapse of law enforcement opened a Pandora's box of threats, both from within and without. Looting became commonplace as desperate survivors scavenged for supplies, often resorting to violence. In the absence of police, property rights were no longer respected, and even the sanctity of human life was frequently disregarded. Militias sprang up in response to this lawlessness, self-appointed guardians who sought to restore order through force. Yet these groups often ended up becoming part of the problem, establishing their own forms of brutal justice and frequently exploiting those they claimed to protect. Power dynamics shifted dramatically and unpredictably, with the balance of control often tipping towards those with the largest arsenal or the most ruthless tactics. Disease, too, posed a significant threat. Without the benefit of modern sanitation, clean water, or medical assistance, epidemics could spread rapidly. Simple cuts could turn septic, while more serious conditions often proved fatal. The lack of vaccines and antibiotics turned previously manageable diseases into death sentences, while new, unknown pathogens emerged from the environmental upheaval. Yet perhaps the most insidious threat was the psychological impact of the collapse. The constant fear, the struggle for survival, the grief for lost loved ones, and a world that no longer existed, it all took a heavy toll on the human psyche. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues became widespread, often leading to suicide or violent outbursts. Survival was not merely a physical challenge, but a psychological one. The human mind had to adapt as much as the body, finding ways to cope with the horror and despair, clinging to hope even when it seemed most elusive. Stories, songs, and shared memories became vital tools for maintaining morale and a sense of community. The environment, too, posed a threat. With industrial activity halted and many cities abandoned, nature began to reclaim its territory. Animals migrated into urban areas, some of them predators. Forests grew uncontrolled, leading to an increased risk of wildfires. And without maintenance, infrastructure crumbled, turning streets into rubble and buildings into death traps. In this new world order, every day was a battle against threats both human and environmental. Survival was a game of wits and endurance, a test of adaptability and resourcefulness. As society crumbled, the lines between civilization and savagery blurred, and the struggle for survival revealed the best and worst of human nature. In this new world, devoid of the structures and systems that once provided order and security, communities had to find ways to self-govern and protect themselves. The complex societies of the past broke down into smaller, self-sustaining units. These micro-societies, often based on pre-existing relationships, neighborhoods, or shared values, became the new norm. Some groups were formed out of necessity, their members brought together by the shared goal of survival. Others were built on mutual trust and cooperation, uniting under strong leaders or common ideals. In many cases, these leaders were not the traditional figures of authority, but individuals who demonstrated resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to make tough decisions. Governance within these groups varied greatly, reflecting the diversity of human societies. Some adopted democratic systems, with decisions made collectively and power distributed equally among members. Others fell under the rule of a single leader or a small group of individuals who held power. It was a delicate balance, with leadership and defense being as much a question of trust as of strength. Defense, in a world where threats lurked around every corner, was a primary concern. Some groups built physical fortifications, repurposing the rubble of the old world into barriers and watchtowers. Others relied on secrecy, hiding their settlements from prying eyes and moving frequently to avoid detection. Many communities trained their members in combat, ensuring everyone could defend themselves and contribute to the group's overall defense. The collapse of law enforcement also led to a shift in the understanding and enforcement of law and order. The legal systems of the past, with their complex statutes and procedures, were replaced by simpler, more direct forms of justice. Some groups adhered to the old laws as much as they could remember or interpret them, while others developed their own codes based on their values and the realities of their situation. However, the collapse also presented an opportunity for communities to rebuild and redefine themselves. The absence of a central authority allowed for experimentation and innovation. New forms of cooperation, governance, and defense were born out of necessity and the desire for a better life. In some cases, these communities managed to create a sense of order and security that surpassed what they had known before the collapse. Throughout it all, the human spirit prevailed. Despite the hardships and dangers, people found ways to cooperate, to trust, and to rebuild. In the face of adversity, humans proved their resilience, adaptability, and endurance. And in the process, they uncovered new depths of compassion, courage, and ingenuity. The collapse of law enforcement and the rise of gang rule may have marked the end of the world as we knew it, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in human evolution. As months turned into years, the immediate shock of the collapse gave way to the pressing need for long-term survival and sustainability. Communities had to adapt, and quickly, to a world without the conveniences of modern civilization. The focus turned towards basic needs: food, water, shelter, and energy. And the key to survival lay in mastering the ancient arts of agriculture, resource management, and self-sufficiency. Agriculture in particular became a lifeline for many communities. While scavenging and hunting could supplement diets, they were not reliable sources of food. Instead, people turned to the earth, planting gardens and crops in vacant lots, rooftops, and any patch of land that could be cultivated. Knowledge of permaculture and organic farming methods, once the preserve of a small group of enthusiasts, became essential survival skills. Water, the lifeblood of any society, presented its own challenges. With public utilities no longer functioning, communities had to find new ways to source and purify water. Rainwater harvesting systems were built, wells were dug, and river water was purified using charcoal and sand filtration systems. In a world without a power grid, renewable energy became the means of survival. Solar panels, wind turbines, and biofuel generators became highly prized assets. Communities that managed to maintain or develop these technologies found themselves in a strong position, able to power essential machinery and maintain a semblance of the technological world that had been lost. Trade, too, found a way to continue, albeit in a drastically altered form. Money, in the traditional sense, was meaningless. Instead, communities developed barter systems, exchanging goods and services based on need and availability. A sack of grain might be traded for medical services or a solar panel for a year's supply of firewood. The value of goods and skills was reassessed in this new post-collapse economy. Survival knowledge, once seen as a hobby for survivalists and preppers, became invaluable. Skills like fire building, navigation, first aid, and foraging were no longer niche interests, but necessary for everyday life. Those who possessed such knowledge became crucial members of their communities, their skills as valuable as any physical resource. In this challenging new world, sustainability became a guiding principle. Wasteful practices of the past were discarded out of necessity. The resources of the earth were revered and conserved, and a new respect for the natural world began to emerge. Communities learned to live in harmony with their environment, taking only what they needed and giving back where they could. Thus, from the ashes of the old world, a new one began to take shape. One guided by necessity, yes, but also by a newfound appreciation for the earth and for the resilience of the human spirit. The collapse of law enforcement and rise of gang rule marked a dark chapter in human history. But it also opened the door to a new era, one of survival, sustainability, and adaptation. As the dust settled and new systems of order began to form, the survivors found themselves navigating a world that bore little resemblance to what they once knew. With the collapse of law enforcement, power vacuums were created that needed to be filled. In many places, gangs that had once operated on the fringes of society stepped into the void, establishing new forms of control and order. These gangs, equipped with weapons and a ruthless determination to survive, became the de facto law in many territories. They enforced their own codes of conduct, often through fear and violence. However, not all power structures that emerged were rooted in intimidation and force. Some communities banded together, pooling their resources and skills to create collective forms of governance. These communities operated on principles of mutual aid, cooperation, and consensus decision-making. In these societies, leadership was often determined by skill and contribution rather than physical strength or ruthlessness. The most respected individuals were those who could contribute the most to the community, whether that was through their knowledge of farming, their ability to generate power, or their medical expertise. Ideology also played a significant role in the shaping of these post-collapse societies. In the absence of established religious or political institutions, new belief systems and philosophies began to emerge. Some communities anchored themselves in spirituality, finding solace and guidance in older, earth-based religions or in new forms of spiritual practice. Others turned to philosophical doctrines, such as anarchism or eco-socialism, to guide their societal structures and decision-making processes. The systems of order that emerged from the collapse were as diverse as the people who navigated them. Some clung to old forms of hierarchy and power, while others sought to build something entirely new. The one constant was adaptation, a willingness to change, to learn, and to survive in whatever way possible. This period of turmoil and transformation also brought with it a re-evaluation of values. Material wealth and status, once so highly prized, were rendered meaningless in the face of survival. Instead, qualities such as resilience, resourcefulness, and community spirit were valued above all else. Survivors found themselves navigating a world where the rules had changed, where the currency was not money, but knowledge, skill, and cooperation. It was a harsh, challenging world, but it was also one of innovation, resilience, and an almost unimaginable adaptability. Through the darkness of the collapse, the human spirit found a way to endure and to carve out a new way of life from the ashes of the old. In the face of the unimaginable, humanity had to grapple with its most primal instincts. The absence of law enforcement saw the rise of both the best and worst aspects of human nature, a dichotomy that was as terrifying as it was illuminating. This was a world where survival was not a given, but a daily struggle, a constant negotiation between man, nature, and his fellow human beings. Amidst the ruins of a civilization once confident in its permanence, the inherent fragility of all human constructs was laid bare. Institutions that had seemed invincible crumbled in an instant, swallowed up by the chaos of a world without law and order. It served as a stark reminder of how quickly the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away, revealing the raw, naked struggle for survival beneath. Yet, even in this bleak landscape, there were glimmers of hope. From the ashes of the old world, new societies and value systems arose. They were not perfect, but they served as a testament to humanity's unyielding spirit, its capacity for creativity, and its determination to survive. In this post-collapse world, survival meant more than just physical endurance. It also meant the survival of empathy, of kindness, and of the ability to connect with others. It meant preserving the capacity for joy, for love, and for hope, even in the midst of despair. It meant maintaining the will to build, to create, and to dream of a better future, no matter how bleak the present seemed. The collapse of law enforcement and the rise of gangs were brutal realities that tested the mettle of humanity. The lessons learned from this period were harsh, but they also offered insight into the resilience of the human spirit, the adaptability of societies, and the enduring capacity for hope. They served as a reminder that survival is not just about enduring, but about finding meaning and purpose in the struggle, about maintaining our humanity in the face of adversity. As we peer into the abyss of a world where law enforcement has collapsed, we are reminded of the fragility of our civilization, of our institutions, and of our way of life. Yet we also catch a glimpse of the indomitable human spirit, its resilience and capacity for adaptation, and its unyielding determination to survive and thrive even in the most challenging of circumstances. In the end, the human story is one of survival, of resilience, of adaptation. It is a story of how, even in the darkest of times, the flame of humanity continues to burn, casting a light that cuts through the gloom, illuminating a path forward out of the darkness. Thanks for listening. This has been How to Survive the Apocalypse. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.